I took the Skillshare writing class, How to Write a Novel Step by Step, and this is my review. Welcome back to Yours in Writing. It's Brandy, and today I'm bringing you episode 2 in a 5-episode series of reviewing Skillshare writing classes. Today I'm reviewing How to Write a Novel Step by Step, Creative and Fiction Novel Book Writing. Now, my first impressions of this class is that it is a book on tape, or it's an audio book. And the reason I know that is because during the class, she mentions several times this book, which tells me that this class was not meant to be a Skillshare class at all, but an audiobook. I looked on Amazon and I did not find the book by the title, How to Write a Novel Step by Step, Creative and Fiction Novel Book Writing. And I also looked up the class's teacher name and I couldn't find it on Amazon. So I'm not sure if it actually became a book or actually became an audiobook, but it wasn't available on Amazon. So be forewarned if you're going to take this class that it was intended to be an audiobook. So let's get into it. Our teacher's name for this class is Grace Riley, and this is the only course she has on Skillshare. From the beginning, there is no course overview. So it doesn't tell you what you're going to be learning, what she's going to be covering. There are no resources and there's no project. So that right there tells me that this is not a class, but it's more of somebody talking at you instead of engaging with you to learn the material. The course is taught over a slideshow with her speaking over it, and there really are no notes on any of the slides. The images are either black and white stills or black and white clips, video clips, and I did not find them very engaging, and honestly, I got bored midway through this class. And I know that maybe that's a format that some students like to learn from, but it's not one that's interesting to me. The difference between this class and the erotic writing class, which was also a slideshow with voiceover, was that the images were very engaging and her voice was very engaging. Unfortunately for this class, the narrator's voice is not engaging at all. It sounds like she's reading, and in a place, actually in one of the places during the class, there's repeated dialogue. So whoever edited the recording together missed that part. And that's fine, but when you're trying to teach a class on writing, you'd at least want someone, you'd at least want that your audio to be good or to be perfect. My audio is not perfect, I know that, but I'm not trying to teach a Skillshare class that people have to pay for. They don't have to pay for the class, they have to pay for the subscription, but still. There are 6 chapters in this online class that is an audiobook, and is presented in chapters. So chapter 1 is the outline. Now this class is admittedly written for, or this audiobook is admittedly written for plotters. So if you're a plotter, this might be helpful. If you're a pantser, it might be helpful. If you're new to novel writing, of course, this book will be helpful for you. So the outline. The first thing that she talks about is the outline is to guide your focus and guide it toward the outcome. It prevents unnecessary info in the plot line or over-explanation and irrelevant things. This is true to a certain extent, but once you get in the writing groove, you're likely to let your fingers do the talking, and a lot of times those things can end up inside of your first draft. That's why it's a first draft. The first draft is you telling the story to yourself, right? And that's a quote by Stephen King, by the way. Then she next talks about the characters from start to end. So it's to guide your characters from start to end. This is where you're going to jot down your plot points. We're still talking about chapter 1, the outline. This is where you're going to jot down your characters, what your characters are going to be doing from plot point to plot point, how your characters are going to get from start to finish, and the things that happen in between. Now, she does talk about creative freedom in chapter 1, meaning whether or not you're a pantser. First of all, when you're writing a novel, it's all your creative freedom, even if you're outlining. But if you are the type of person to stick rigidly to an outline, then it does kind of limit your creative freedom, because you have your outline and you know what you want to put in the book. That might leave no room for you to explore your characters and explore your setting and explore the world that you've built. That's fine if that's how you like to write. And if it's not how you like to write, then, you can always veer off from your outline. Then she talks about a hindsight outline, which means if you are writing your book and you've started writing, you can go back and outline the things that you've already written and maybe add some elements to your outline that you'd like to explore more of, or that you'd like to include in your novel. At the end of the chapter, she has a section called Questions to Ask Yourself When Outlining. In every chapter, at the end of each chapter, there is a section called Questions to Ask Yourself. And there are about 10 questions for each chapter. I'm not going to go over all of the questions to ask yourself for each chapter, but I will go over the first section, the first questions to ask yourself. That's in chapter 1, the outline. So those questions are: where is my protagonist starting? Number 2, where are they in their life at the beginning of the story? 3, where are they ending? 4, where are they at the ending of the story? 5, what major plot points are getting me to, or have gotten me to, the goal? 6, do the plot points make sense together? 7, is the outline weak anywhere? 8, what else can I add to the outline to make a rich reading experience? Sorry, I couldn't read my writing there for a second. These questions, you can ask yourself these questions. It's a first draft and it's an outline, so I'm sure they're helpful to some people. I feel like these questions for me would not be helpful at all. But again, I'm a pantser. I am not a plotter. I don't do outlines because they don't work for me. I don't like to stick to something rigid. I like to have ideas and I put them down on paper, and they might change. I find some of the questions to be redundant, and that's just my opinion, but that's how I feel. So we're on to chapter 2, setting. In this chapter, she discusses the setting, and this chapter is 16 minutes and 27 seconds long, which I believe is way too long to talk about settings, but that's my opinion. So here she talks about setting. She says the setting should be identified beforehand. This is very true. You need to know where your story is going to take place and in what time period it's going to take place. She says for consistency and relevance to the time and place, your story should be researched. So of course, if you're going to write a historical fiction story, of course, you're going to want to research. If you are not very, very savvy on that time and place that you're setting your story in, like if you're setting your story in medieval England, then you should know who was king at that time, if it's a historical fiction. Now, the caveat here is if your story is a historical fantasy fiction, which means if you're using an alternate universe or an alternate Earth or whatever planet you're on, of course your characters you're not going to have to research the time, your setting. You're going to create that, but you still have to be consistent. So you might want to make a Bible for your novel. That's something else that we'll talk about in another video. For now, she talks about researching. So you should research the location. You should research the time period. And If you're writing about the present, then of course you don't have to do that much research, but it helps to know how people acted. So she talks about here people's attitudes, their behaviors, maybe the class system that was in place during the time and that location, how people treated each other, how they interacted with each other. These are all important things when discussing your setting. I agree with her here, definitely. And if you're world building, again, you're going to have to be as detailed as possible in your own mind. And it might be easier for you to build a world instead of relying on history to write your novel. But some historical fiction is very, very accurate. And then again, there are details. There are some historical fictions that just throw out things and put people in places that shouldn't be at the same time, like maybe Queen Elizabeth I is in the same time period as Napoleon. So pay attention to your settings and your time periods and whatnot. You're also going to want to pay attention to the slang and the terminology, the language, the vernacular that you're using in your book if you're writing your books in a different time period or a different setting. You're not going to want to use today's slang in a book that is set in the 70s. There are lots of words that we use today that they didn't use in the 70s, and it would not make sense to have that language in such a book. So keep those things in mind, and that's what she is talking about for setting. I don't know why this chapter was 16 minutes and 27 seconds long, but it was unnecessarily long, and there was a lot of redundant and unnecessary information in this chapter. I had to skip through the chapter because, again, it wasn't that engaging and I got bored. So on to chapter 3. Chapter 3 discusses point of view. This chapter is 13 minutes and 52 seconds long, which is more appropriate for a chapter on a chapter on point of view, because there are multiple points of view that you can write your story in. So she discusses the first person points of view and its advantages and disadvantages. So, of course, the advantages of the first person point of view is that you get the range of emotions, you get to know what your character is thinking, you get to see the world through your character's eyes. If you're writing a book in the first person, a lot of times you can feel like you are the character, and that helps to draw you into the story. So that, of course, is an advantage. The disadvantage of the story is that you only get to see your character's point of view. So any of the other characters in the story, you don't get to learn what they're doing from their day-to-day and how they're feeling about certain things, unless they actually say it in dialogue or unless your character is a mind reader. So those are things to keep in mind for a first-person point of view. She discusses the second-person point of view. Publishers will often refuse to publish books that are written in the second point of view. Second point of view is the least popular point of view, obviously, for books, because second-person point of view is the you point of view. It's me talking directly to you. And it's hard to write a fiction book from the second-person point of view. Now, there are authors who have done it and done it well. But when you're writing a book in the second point of view, you need to be a very, very, very good writer to do this, to pull this off. It can be jarring, it can feel unnatural to read a book that's in the second person point of view. And so publishers a lot of times they will not publish, especially from a new author, they will not publish a book that's written in the second person point of view. Then we go to the third person point of view, and there are two options for third person point of view. Omniscient narrator, the third person is the omniscient narrator. The options here are limited omniscient and unlimited omniscient. So limited omniscient is that the narrator only knows specific details. They might not be able to discuss what is going on in your main character's mind, in your protagonist's mind. They might not be able to discuss what the characters are, thinking. There might be details that they lack. With unlimited point of view, your narrator knows everything. They know what time your main character was born. They know what your main character is thinking. They know what your main character is going to have for lunch. They know what dirty secrets your main character has. The unlimited, omniscient, third-person point of view is one of the most popular points of view. So first person and unlimited, omniscient, third person those two are the most popular. They're two types of books that you're going to come across the most in your fiction reading. There are questions to ask yourself for this chapter. I'm not going to go through them. I did not write them down because I had no interest in learning them. I'm sorry. But again, if you'd like to take this class, are more than welcome, and you will learn all the questions to ask yourself. Chapter 4 is characters. Characters, again, are the people that drive your story. Your characters can be human. Your characters can be non-human. They can be trees. They can be a table. Your characters can be whatever you want them to be, whoever you want them to be. They can live wherever you want them to live. They can do whatever you want them to do. They're your characters. They are the ones that drive your story forward. In this chapter, she discusses the value of your characters. Yes, your characters are the most valuable things in your story. Who wants to read a story that doesn't have characters? How do you write a story that doesn't have characters? It's kind of difficult, I think, maybe. I fast forwarded through this chapter because I got super bored. So, if you'd like to learn more about characters, take this class. Chapter 5 is about conflict. So every story needs conflict. She says, conflict makes your story realistic. Life isn't perfect, and neither should the lives of your characters. This is true. Who wants to read a story about a perfect person? That's boring. In this chapter, she discusses primary and secondary conflicts. So your protagonist will have usually a primary conflict, and then a secondary conflict might be going on between other characters, or it might be going on in your character's mind. It might be an internal conflict. As discussed in erotic writing, there are two types of conflict. There is an external conflict and an internal conflict. Your character might be having, his primary conflict might be an external conflict, and his secondary conflict might be an internal conflict, or vice versa. Your character could be conflicted with himself. That would be fun. So she talks about when to introduce conflicts, when to introduce your secondary conflict, and when they should occur. You can introduce your conflict whenever you want to introduce your conflict. You can introduce your conflict at the beginning of the story or in the middle of the story. It just depends on how you want to tell your story. And again, it is your story. You can introduce your conflict toward the end of your story. However, if you're doing it at the end of your story, it's going to have to be resolved pretty quickly. So keep that in mind when you're writing your novel. I did manage to write down the questions to ask yourself for this chapter. Some of the questions are, what is the primary conflict? How many primary conflicts do I want? What type of secondary conflicts do I want? What type of secondary conflicts can I use to build up to the primary conflict? What secondary conflicts can I use to wind down from the primary conflicts? How do I want the conflict? Uh-oh. I guess I stopped writing. I don't know. How do I want the conflict to something, something, something. I think the conflict chapter was the most interesting chapter, even though the conflict chapter was 9 minutes and 28 seconds. It might have been the most interesting chapter that I saw, and which is why I probably watched it all the way through. But on to chapter 6. Chapter 6 is additional tips. It's 13 minutes and 23 seconds long. 13 minutes and 23 seconds longer than it should be. Additional tips is what she says. There are quotes from authors and just random tips. So here she says, tackling a common plot line from a different angle, element, or theme. She says that a lot of stories have similar plot lines because there are millions of stories that have been told and millions of books that have been written. A lot of them have similar stories, and a lot of times they're the same story just told from a different point of view. So she says, don't try to rewrite the wheel. Just see if the plot line is something that you can tackle from another angle. Maybe you're writing a story from a different character's point of view. Everyone is the hero in their own story. So imagine telling the story from the villain's side, telling the story from an onlooker's perspective. These are just things to keep in mind, because a lot of times we have ideas and we say, darn it, it's already been done, or other people say, well, it's derivative. Of course it is. You know why it's derivative? Because the story's probably been told 100 times or more. Love stories, most of the time a love story has the same part. Boy meets girl, girl resists boy, or boy resists girl, or boy or girl does something to drive boy or girl away. All of those stories have been written. So you have to make the story your own. Basically, that is what she talks about in the first part of chapter 6, the additional tips. Second, she discusses deadlines. She says, give yourself leeway and grace on a deadline. This should be something that is a given. Unless you have a publisher that wants your book, they set your deadline should be something that is adjustable. Giving yourself a rigid deadline is not helpful, and it's not conducive to good writing. It's not conducive to creativity. It just isn't. If you're writing a book and you say, I'm going to write my book in 2 weeks, and it's a 100,000 word book, that kind of deadline is literally the type of deadline that could drive you to have gray hair, that could raise your blood pressure. It can do all kinds of bad stuff to your body just because you're putting all that pressure, that mental pressure on yourself. Now, if you're the type of person that likes a strict deadline and you know that you can hit that deadline, that's fine. The only caveat to this is NaNoWriMo, in my opinion, because you have 30 days to write 50,000 words, and that's totally doable. So when coming up with deadlines, definitely give yourself a little break. A good test reader. So the third point she makes in additional tips is to get a good test reader. Yes, get a good test reader. Your story is meant to be read by someone, by people. So get yourself a test reader. Don't get 5 test readers. Get 1 or 2, because everybody has an opinion, and those 5 people are probably going to have 5 different opinions, and all that's going to do is stress you out. So get a test reader, someone that you trust, someone who can give you honest feedback, someone who maybe is impartial, that you don't know very well. There are test readers you can get on Fiverr. There are lots of forums where people offer test reading service. Beta readers is what they're called. So you can find beta readers on places like Goodreads. You can find, there's a Facebook group that has beta readers. I'm pretty sure there's more than one Facebook group. Twitter, you can find beta readers there. There are lots of places to find beta readers. Reddit, you can find beta readers on Reddit. Just do a quick Google search. The fourth point she makes is to avoid perfectionism. Yes, avoid perfectionism. Perfection does not exist. The only perfect thing are the things that were created by nature. And since a story was not created by nature, a story comes from your mind, and you probably have an idea of how your story is going to sound, what it's going to look like, and all those other things. However, striving for perfectionism is not going to be conducive to good creativity. You can write it, your first draft, especially your first draft. That's not going to be perfect at all. So that's why there are second, third, fourth, and fifth drafts. However, if you are trying to be perfect, you're never going to get your story done. So get it done, get it good enough, polish it as well as you can, and then start submitting if that's what you want to do. Fifth point is write what you don't know. She says that lots of times the people give writing advice of write what you know. Then she says writing what you don't know is also helpful. So if there's something that you don't know, like something you'd like to learn about, maybe if you want to write a historical fiction book, you don't know about a particular topic, but you'd like to know about it, writing what you don't know might be helpful because it'll drive you to learn about that thing that you don't know. That's fun. And then number 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. The sixth part is to manipulate your reader's emotions. You want your readers to have an emotional reaction to your book. That can be laughter, that can be tears, that can be anger, that can be serenity. But you have a goal in writing your story, and that is to drive your readers to an emotional reaction. If you can make your reader laugh, if you can make your reader cry, if you can make your reader smile, then you've done your job as a writer. I think this is probably one of the best pieces of advice she gives in this chapter, and I did watch chapter 6 all the way through. It's a 13-minute and 23-minute chapter. But manipulating your reader's emotions is something that she says to do, and it's a good idea. So that is how to write a novel step by step. An hour and 14-minute class that was an audiobook that someone uploaded onto Skillshare as a class. Again, there were no resources and there were no projects. The instructor, the teacher, whoever uploaded it onto Skillshare didn't have the student in mind when uploading the class. There was no projects to get the student in the practice of doing anything as in regard to writing a novel. And so overall, I gave this class on a scale of 1 to 10, a 4. I gave it a 4 because someone who is very new to novel writing probably can learn something from this class. It did have some solid information, but I feel the class was longer than it needed to be. There was superfluous information in the class, and honestly, it was boring. Sorry, Grace Riley, the class was boring. It wasn't a class, it was an audiobook. So let's get that clear. But a 4 is not a 1, so there are probably other classes, better classes that you can find on YouTube that help you to get started novel writing and that are more interesting and engaging to watch. I did not find this class. It's not one that I would take again, and it really isn't one. The only people that I would recommend this class to are people who have never written anything. If you came straight out of high school and never wrote again, this is what I would recommend for you as a how to write a novel class. Someone who's maybe written a short story maybe written some poetry, something like that. Somebody who enjoys writing as a hobby even, I would not recommend this class if they asked me, how do I write a novel? And what classes would you recommend to me to learn how to write my first novel? This just wouldn't be it. And that's my honest opinion. So with that, I will say I still enjoy Skillshare. And again, Skillshare is not paying me for these reviews. The next class that I will be reviewing, however, is writing suspense, how to write stories that thrill in any genre. And that will be up next Monday. Please come on back for that review. And if you have any questions, any comments, if you'd like to drop some feedback, please do so in the comments. I'd love to know what you think. Whatever, good or bad. And until next time, yours in writing. Chapter 6 is additional conflict. Sorry, what's her name?